Hey guys, hope you're well. Welcome to another session of computer architecture. If you remember well, what we were looking at is chapter number 28. And the last clip I uploaded was part one of that distinctive chapter. And remember, what we were looking at is analyzing security threats. So today's session, what we're going to be looking at is security concepts and technologies. And I think our main focus is going to be on access control. Now, if you remember well, we did mention the whole concept of securing machines, securing the data that is currently stored on them. And arguably, I think our distinctive focus was understanding exactly what these threats are so that you can typically understand how to circumvent any distinctive issues that are typically encountered from these distinctive threats. So when you're looking at the whole concept of security technologies as well as concepts, ultimately these are the things that you would need to undertake in order for you to successfully, or to some extent, make it more difficult for intrusion as far as your particular existence is concerned, obviously both on a personal as well as professional scale. So the first thing, like I was saying a couple of moments ago, is looking at access control. And as far as access control is concerned, you've got four distinctive interlinked parts that are relevant in that arena. And these parts would typically include the whole issue of physical security. Remember, the whole concept is, I think we did mention this before, that you can have the most intricate of architectures in terms of safeguarding your content or safeguarding your material, in terms of biometrics, the complex passwords, the list will go on and on. But if you don't physically secure those gadgets that house that particular data, then it becomes a null and void event. So you've got physical security that you need to take cognizance of. You will also want to discuss authentication. Now, I think with the whole concept of authentication, you've got the usernames and passwords that obviously, or electronic credentials that enable you to gain access to a specific environment, to a specific system. It all depends. And it's ultimately imperative for you to understand what criteria you need to take into consideration when you look at these electronic credentials. And then the third one you want to also consider is looking at the whole concept of users and groups. So technically you need to define which users access your machine, and you obviously can classify them into distinctive groups as well, so that you know exactly who does what and what they're responsible for as far as your environments are concerned. And then lastly, what you'll then need to consider is security policies. So when you look at the whole concept of physical security, so this is the looking at a way in which you can limit access to a specific environment, can limit access to a specific computer system or specific set of computer systems. It all depends. And typical examples of what you would take into consideration here is for instance, name tags or user badge or ID badges. And you see the brilliance of the ID badges is that you've got a twofold a setup that is there, because these ID badges can then typically state who the actual individual is, and at the same time you can look at incorporating RFID configurations or smart cards there. Remember, RFID is short for radio frequency identification, and these are the actual, or this is the actual architecture rather, that you can use to enable someone to gain access to a distinctive environment. So if that particular card or ID badge is not activated or doesn't have the appropriate architecture, then you can ultimately limit access to a distinctive environment there. So it's quite brilliant in the fact that, like I was saying earlier on, it's a twofold platform. But remember, the actual drawback is that if someone loses that, it might be arguably quite detrimental, because someone can use it willy-nilly. That's the reason why sometimes you might need to take into consideration multi-factor identification or authentication, where you use different forms or multiple forms of authentication methods to enable someone to gain access to an environment, or to enable someone to gain access to a distinctive system. When you look at usage, especially when you're dealing with miniaturized devices like your laptops as an argument. You can also use what they call a privacy filter. So this is more or less like a cover that you typically put on your screen to avoid. Remember last time we were talking about securing machines, we did discuss the whole concept of shoulder surfing. So this is arguably another perfect way to try and safeguard this unauthorized access or unscrupulous individuals checking what you're actually doing as far as your computing systems are concerned. So it's more or less like a sheet that you would pull over your specific screens. It's obviously dark in format, just to obviously avoid individuals accessing your particular setup there. I think it's involving, but ultimately it's important because, like we were saying in the previous session, it's ultimately important for you to make sure that you safeguard your content, you safeguard your gadgets, regardless of the behavior actually being borderline in terms of you being quite pedantic in terms of the way in which you try and safeguard this data. But these are quite relevant. So you've got your privacy filter. You can also even talk about password protected screensavers, so that at least you avoid again unauthorized access within your distinctive environments. I think we did discuss shredders in the previous session, and we said that if you've got any documentation that you need to discard or get rid of, I think it's appropriate for you not to just casually throw that away in your bins, but to make sure that you use the appropriate gadgets there. And then arguably we did discuss shredders, and obviously those will be arguably the best you would use in terms of discarding documentation appropriately there. So again, both in your own personal or professional spaces, but make sure that you take cognizance of these distinctive devices. So with access control or with physical security, I think that is what is relevant within that particular confines. I think from your own research, just pop me a mail to state, or more or less to maybe give me a heads up in terms of the other methods that you can use to try and limit physical security, or to try and limit physical access, obviously hindering within the whole concept of physical security there. And then the second one, like we mentioned before, is looking at authentication. All right, so this now is delving more towards the actual software platform, and it introduces another interesting concept, which is known as the AAA. So you've got authentication as the first A, you've got authorization as the second one, and then you've got auditing or accounting as the third. So when you look at authentication, like we said before, that's your generic usernames and passwords. So these are electronic credentials that you'd arguably use to try and gain access to a distinctive system. So with authentication, usernames and passwords, and again, then again, with your passwords, remember these need to be complex. And normally what is typically inclined in these particular instances is that your password needs to be at least 8 characters. Now, in essence, to be very pedantic about this, you can use up to 256 characters. It all depends on the type of platforms that you're using. But remember, most of us don't arguably use the entirety of that. And it's quite an advantage, because there is also another argument where most schools of thought would argue that a long password is ultimately or arguably a bit more secure than a short complex one. Because remember, the shorter the password, the easier, or the less combinations in terms of trying to crack that distinctive password. But obviously, the longer the password would be, makes it a bit more difficult. Because remember, at the end of the day, systems are not arguably 100% secure, but then you're pushing towards that when you put all these measures in place. So the first thing you need to consider is at least 8 characters. The second one, you're throwing in your letters, your numbers, your special characters into that particular password. And then naturally, the third one is you need to make sure that you change or update these particular passwords on a regular basis. Normally, most of us would create a password and would use that password for weeks, months, and sometimes even years on end. But remember, it's not recommended practice, because you want to make sure that you make it a bit more difficult for anyone to try and illegally or access your platforms in an unauthorized fashion. And I think what is arguably also important in that particular vein is that try and not use anything that is a link to you directly. So as simple or as obvious to some extent as it sounds, you need to make sure that it's got nothing to do with you as an individual, so nothing to do with your birthdays, your pet names, your favorite movies, or your favorite places of entertainment as an argument. Anything that is not familiar to you as an individual is recommended in that foray. So just take cognizance of that fact. So just revisiting that, your passwords need to be at least 8 characters in terms of length. You need to throw in alphanumeric configurations there. So that means that you're looking at your letters. And remember, with your letters, combine both capitals and lowercase. Then you've got the special characters, and then you need to also throw in numbers there. So try and, especially when you look at the numbers and the special characters, try and not throw them in there in consecutive fashion. Just mix it up just to make it a lot more difficult as far as the whole guessing game there is concerned. So that's that in terms of authentication. And then when you look at authorization, what is actually happening here now is that, remember, you've gotten access to a system, right? So both standalone or networked, you've been granted access. But remember, authorization now is looking at what that particular account is allowed to do or is permitted to do on that network or computer system. So this is what authorization is all about now. So you'll have several accounts that can do certain things, and you obviously will have other accounts that can do other things, and there's different limitations in that particular vein. And I think this is also quite brilliant, because you can then state, I think it goes back to what we mentioned again a couple of moments ago. When you look at the users and groups, what are the different users that are there, what are the different groups that these users can be thrown in, and what are they allowed to do on the system. So this is what authorization is all about. And then the third A now is auditing or accounting. So this is now checking what these particular accounts or users have done on the system. So it's more or less like a reporting mechanism that then checks to say, okay, so-and-so is logged onto the system. This is what they accessed. These are the applications they used. This is the amount of time they spent on the system. The list will go on and on. So it's also quite relevant in the fact that when you run your particular reporting, you then can tell who's done what on the system, and there's a specific audit system or configuration that is thrown into that foray there. I think another interesting thing as well is you can talk or throw in forensics. So remember, forensics is to do with again, that whole concept of checking, that whole concept of reporting, and more often than not, you can deal with ICT evidence. So when you deal with a specific documentation, or when you deal with specific content, make sure that you note the times that you've logged into the system. Make sure you've noted the times that you've actually accessed distinctive content, and also make note of the times that you've logged out of the system to create a proper audit trail. And if you do hand that system to someone else, or if you do end up handing that documentation or that whatever content that you find or work on that system, or that is relevant in your particular environments there, also make a note of proper what they call a chain of custody. So proper handing over to say, okay, look, I was working on this documentation, this is what I've done, or I was working on this particular material, this is what I've done, this is the last thing that I did, and once I concluded that, I then obviously gave it to someone else. Take note and take heed of that, so that at least if there are any discrepancies that end up happening, then you obviously have a specific record, and it makes it a lot easier for everyone else in that environment. So that's your auditing as well as your account. So auditing, in some literatures might want to call it accounting, but it's a whole concept of just checking what or reporting on what a specific account has done as far as your environments would go. So with the whole concept of authentication in general, remember, you've got hardware and software based platforms. So when it's software, the typical examples which we've already discussed is the usernames and passwords. in terms of enabling you to gain access to a system. But then if you're looking at or access to specific environments, but when you're looking at hardware authentication now, I think you can discuss the main concept or the main architecture within that environment is biometrics. And remember, last time we mentioned this particular term, we said that it's using human beings' unique physical characteristics to typically gain access to a given system or environment. So again, like we've mentioned before, your retina scanners, your fingerprint scanners, your voice recognition platforms, even palm readers and face read configurations are also something that you can discuss when you're looking at the whole concept of distinctive biometrics there. So ultimately important for you to take cognizance of, especially when you discuss the whole concept of authentication. I think another thing when you are looking at it from a hardware perspective is smart cards as well. But I think, like I was saying again a couple of moments ago, when you're looking at such architectures, I think it's imperative for you to throw in what they call multi-factor or two-factor authentication there. So at least someone would probably need to use an access card, and then as far as that access card is concerned, they might need to punch in a combination in order for them to gain access, or they put in their particular access card or smart card there, and then you'll need to incorporate maybe a fingerprint reader there as well, because at least that makes your environments slightly more secure as far as distinctive access there is concerned. So the other thing as well is your users and groups. So remember, as far as users are concerned, you've got the generic, especially if you look at the Windows platform, you've got generic users, you've got power users, you've got administrators, you've got guests. So you can categorize users in an appropriate fashion, so that at least, again, that whole concept of the auditing we were talking about earlier on, and obviously authorization comes into the foray there, and it makes it a lot easier for you to try and create more secure systems. And this also brings to mind what we've discussed when we were looking at chapter number 9 and 10, where we looked at the whole concept of hard drive technologies, and also looking at implementation of these hard drives. And I think one of the other things that we mentioned when we're looking at those sections in as far as module content is concerned is the file systems. And remember, with file systems, we talked about FAT, file allocation table, and then we also discussed NTFS, new technologies or new technology file system. And one of the things we mentioned is that NTFS has 5 distinctive features that make it a preferable file system as far as using your storage media is concerned. And these 5 features would include what they call disk quotas. You've got the first one, not in that distinctive order, and then the second one is cluster sizing. You can also talk about compression. And then the last 2 that I'm going to mention, obviously, are the ones that are relevant in terms of the whole concept of the users and groups. And that is file and folder security, as well as the last one, which is encryption. So these are the 2 features that stand out when you're discussing the whole concept of security. And naturally, when you're talking about the users and groups, you can then use these distinctive features and architectures to determine what's happening as far as the groups are concerned, or determine what's happening as far as the users, what they can actually do on this, or what they're allowed to do on the system, and ultimately also then put them into a distinctive group to look at umbrella assignment of what is happening as far as your environments would go. So that's that in terms of users and groups. And then obviously the last concept you want to concentrate on in that particular vein is your security policy. So this is typically outside the actual scope of resources. So with your policies, you're actually looking at it from a system perspective. Now someone has actually gotten access to the system, and what are the policies that you've put in place in terms of what type of softwares they can use on your system, what is it that they can incorporate as far as basic access there is concerned. So when you look at that whole concept, I think the main takeout is looking at the whole concept of the access controller I was mentioning a couple of moments ago, and then also discussing the whole concept of those 4 interlinked platforms that are there. your physical security, your authentication, your users and groups, and ultimately your security policies there. So in the third part, we want to discuss data compliance. We also want to look at the whole concept of licensing. And then after we discuss those distinctive concepts, then we will delve into network security there. So in the third part, I think it's going to be a slightly shorter one. I'm just going to concentrate a little bit more on what's happening as far as data compliance and licensing is concerned. And then in the fourth part, delve into what is happening as far as network security. And then ultimately, if need be, we might need to have another conclusive part. But ultimately, I think our part 4 would be our conclusion rather, as far as this particular chapter is concerned. So there you have it, guys. If there are any questions, please pop me a mail and I'll attend to them accordingly. But as far as today's session is concerned, this is where we end it. And I'll see you in the next clip. Again, probably I'll post it within the next 48 hours or so. But naturally, I will give you a heads up on the VC Learn announcement platform. So stay safe, guys. Keep positive and always be of good spirits as usual. I'll see you in the next clip. Cheers.